Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I'm extremely excited to have our guest on the show. She is the representative for the Facebook page Pro-Life Atheist, and I'm sure that she does a lot of other things for the pro-life movement. But the main thing that I'm interested in, or that I find really interesting about this interview, is that, number one is that for me as the host of this page, I'm interested in hearing different viewpoints and people from different perspectives. But there are those interesting times where we find that liberals and conservatives actually agree. When I originally invited our guest onto the show, she was worried that maybe she was too liberal, and I said, no, the more the merrier. So thank you for coming onto the show, and it's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So I think the most surprising thing about this interview is that people aren't going to believe that it's actually happening. So people believe that it's impossible to be leftist, feminist, atheist, and pro-life. Those four just seem to contradict somehow when you put them all together. But it seems as if you've been able to do it. So can you kind of maybe explain your story and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so basically, when I was in middle school, I was starting to find myself and where I belong on the political spectrum. So I started realizing that all my beliefs were in line with the left-wing side of the spectrum. I've always been like very pacifist, kind of a hippie, very against war and against violence, and wanting to support basically everyone and support equal rights and fight against like racism and homophobia and all these different things. So I knew I was very liberal, and I've always considered myself a feminist, like pretty much my whole life. I just always knew that like people should have equal rights, and it shouldn't be based off of sex. We shouldn't be given advantages or disadvantages based on sex. So I've always felt a kinship with the feminist movement and the liberal movement. And then I realized I was an atheist at that time too. My whole mom's side of the family is Mormon, so I was taken to church when I was a little kid, but they stopped pretty soon, maybe when I was like 6 or 7. And when you're that young, you don't really know what's going on anyway. So I wouldn't consider myself to have been religious at that point. So basically, middle school was how I realized I was an atheist as well. So I already had those things going for me, and the whole I'm a vegan too, and I kind of had vegan ideals during that time as well. I was like, oh my God, why are we stealing the milk and eggs from cows and chickens and stuff like that? So I pretty much had started to figure myself out around this time. And I think I was 14, and I asked my mom what abortion was. She's not that political of a person. I would say she's probably pro-life, but she's not like into it like I am. But I think she said something basic, like it's the termination of a pregnancy or something. But being the science kid that I was, I knew that that was killing a child because I got straight A's in school. I was like a math and science nerd as well. And we know in biology class in middle school, like when the sperm meets the egg, like that's basically you, that your DNA is like put in place. And so I didn't need anyone to tell me that that was the killing of a child because science did that for me. So that's basically how I became pro-life, was just knowing what abortion was and being like, oh no, that's the killing of a child. Like that's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that to be pro-life doesn't really require any, prior religious commitments.
Yeah.
It's a position that anybody could really come to if you just begin with the basic principles of ethics and science. Um, so before we continue then, we could go into a lot of different issues, but I also want to discuss then, you kind of alluded to it, but what is your justification for being pro-life?
So basically, I think that, well, basically liberalism in general is the supporting of everyone who is weak and innocent and vulnerable and poor and downtrodden, and like basically anyone who needs help. So I always thought that if anything, the most liberal or progressive or Democrat or socialist or whatever word you want to say, the most thing that fits all those is being pro-life, because the unborn are the most innocent, the most vulnerable, the most weak, the most helpless and defenseless and voiceless. So they need our help the most because they literally cannot say, hey, stop killing me, don't oppress me, like stop aborting us. So we need to be their voice basically. So that's kind of how that was like the first thing was, okay, the science tells us that they're humans and that's when we become human. Liberalism tells us to fight for justice and like fight against discrimination and oppression and fight for the little guy. And then feminism, I kind of assumed that only conservative deadbeat dads created abortion and supported it, because it seemed to me like if you're a woman and you're pregnant and you feel the kid moving around inside of you, like you know it's alive, you know it's your child. It must be men that are for abortion, because they wouldn't feel that. They wouldn't know that that's like, that's why there are like so many women in the pro-life movement, because it hits us harder because we're the ones that actually get pregnant and we're closer to knowing that it's a child in there, because men don't have to have the same experience. But being liberal, I just assumed, okay, well, this can't be a liberal thing to be pro-choice, so it must be the conservatives. So, like, boy, did I get that wrong. But, like, I don't know. It just seemed really backwards. Like, the sides were totally switched on that. I just never would have guessed that people who agree with me on all these other social justice issues would be pro-choice. That just sounded weird.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know this, but the early feminists were themselves pro-life. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's Susan B. Anthony, but she said something along the lines that you did, that men want to avoid fatherhood, avoid responsibility, so then they just let the woman have an abortion to escape that responsibility and abandon the
Yeah.
woman.
Yeah, a lot of guys kind of go the deadbeat dad route, and then they kind of pressure us into abortion. Not all men, but some men do. And so it's like, it's harder for us because we're more connected to the child through pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding and all these different things. But guys, they're less, like, they're more able to step away and be like, no, I don't want this kid, and I don't want to have to pay for it. I don't want child. I don't want, like, what is the word? When you pay for the kid.
Child support.
Yeah, child support.
Hmm.
I don't want to have to do any of that. It's your kid. You do it. You're the mother. Like, you take care of it. So it's just like, it's more, I see it as a feminist issue. I've always had feminist ideals against abortion, because it seems like a lot of men exploit us by walking away and like pushing us to abortion so that they don't have to have kids.
But then, the natural response is, well, what if the woman doesn't want the kid, right? You're forcing her against her will to have this child. So, let's not talk about bodily autonomy just yet, or personhood. But I think the immediate impression of being pro-life is that you're anti-woman, right? And like,
Yeah.
so, where does that idea come from, and how would you, as someone who's obviously a feminist and a woman, would respond to that claim?
I think it's just purely dehumanization of the unborn and trying to only ever think of the parent and not the child. Because when we like other the unborn, we like separate ourselves from them and we only focus on one party, and we pretend, oh, like this is what's happening to the mother. This is all about the mother. So therefore you must be doing something wrong to the mother. When in reality, the action itself is killing the child. Like, you should be allowed to abort your own body, but not someone else's body, you know? Like, if abortion weren't on the child's body, it wouldn't be like an issue like it is. It's just they only want to think about the mother because they want to dehumanize the child so much and just say, oh, well, you must be forcing the mother to do something, when it's, no, we're saying she shouldn't be allowed to force her child to die.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess that, that kind of goes into another point, really, which is that, at least in my reading of like the pro-choice arguments, if we take the point that a woman has bodily autonomy seriously, then maybe that could at least so justify maybe active euthanasia if they decide to kill themselves, but not the child, because that's a different
Yeah.
body. So let me press some common pro-choice arguments onto you and get your reaction to them, right? So probably the most common rebuttal that I hear is that, well, it's just a clump of cells. It's just, a bunch of, little genes and stuff going together, but it's not like human. It's not a person. How would you respond to the it's a clump of cells argument?
Yeah, that just goes back to learning about embryology and being a science nerd, where we know from science that fertilization is the point where we become a distinct living human being, as opposed to just a cell of the body of the woman or the man. And then learning about the development timeline is interesting too, because the heart starts beating at 2 to 3 weeks after conception, and the brain is there at 2 to 3 weeks. And this is before we even know we're pregnant. And limb buds form at 3 to 4 weeks. So by the time all abortions happen, not only do they have beating hearts and brains, but also heads and eyes and arms and legs and fingers and toes and all these different things. So there's no way to call that just the clump of cells. Like that's a not only is it scientifically labeled as a human being, but it looks like one too. It's got different body parts. They've got different organs. They've got different limbs. And you can clearly see that it's like basically a mini child. And so it's like you really have to just ignore science in order to think it's a clump of cells.
Hmm. Well, okay, so then they'll say, okay, fine, I grant you that it's genetically human, right? And it has all these distinctive qualities, but it's not a person just yet. And to be a person, maybe it means consciousness, it means some higher mental function. How would you respond to that argument?
Yeah, I tend to reject the concept of personhood because it's always been used to take away rights from others.
Hmm.
Women like me, I even just found this out recently, but the Canadian Constitution said that women are not persons in 1928 or somewhere around there, so that we couldn't be politicians. So we were written into the Canadian Constitution as not being persons. Like, how am I as a woman supposed to be like thinking that this concept of personhood is really good when it specifically said that I would not have had rights? And same with slaves. In the US Constitution, slaves were literally written into the Constitution as only 3/5 of a person. And even that was to treat them as property of their slave owners, to count up how much property slave owners had. So, and then of course the Jewish Holocaust, Jewish people were considered not persons, and LGBT people have been considered not persons. And personhood has just always been used to take away rights from others. So I think it really needs to go back to where the human beingness, like the biological human beingness is, because we can't trust ourselves with using the term person because we always take away rights from others by calling them non-persons.
Yeah, and I mean, like, when we consider liberalism and how it strives to be inclusive, shouldn't we go for the most inclusive definition of personhood and humanity, which is just merely being human? Like, that seems to be a conclusion that liberalism would have.
Yeah, that's what I always thought. It's like really ironic that they're trying to like go the other way and say, well, let's count this, and this as a person so that we can exclude this group. Like, we're the inclusive side. Like, what are you doing here?
All right. So they say, okay, fine. Let's say that it's human, it's a person, but the woman has a right to her body to decide what she's going to do with it, right? And she has maybe the right even to decide, who occupies that space and who uses her resources and so forth, right? So she has that absolute sovereignty. You can't tell her otherwise.
Yeah, that kind of goes to the phrase, my right to swing my fist ends at your nose, which means my right to own my body and do what I want with my body ends when there's another body there. And especially considering the fact that the child did not like invade our bodies, we kind of put them there through biological processes. They're completely innocent in the matter. They're not conscious and aware and making choices. So it's not even a case of like a rapist who forces its body inside of your body. It's just the body doesn't even know that it's there. So how are we supposed to be like, okay, but I should get to destroy and kill this other body who's completely innocent, completely not aware of what it's doing or why it's there? Like, it's just, it doesn't make sense to me as a liberal because it sounds like oppression, basically. So I don't really know why anyone would argue, oh, I get to kill whoever's in my body, even if they're completely innocent in the matter. Like, that would be like saying I can force a 2-year-old who's been knocked unconscious inside of my vagina if they'll fit, and then like abort them. Like, that, no one would be okay with that. That would be weird.
All right. So, well, let's say that somebody accepts. Okay, like it seems like you're making valid points, Kristen, but you know what? It's not your business. It's not your job to tell other people what to do with themselves, so you should just mind your own business.
To that, I would say, well, that's why I'm a liberal and why I'm an activist, because I think I need to like stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. I think when others are being hurt, it's everyone's business. And if we just act selfish like that and say, oh, well, it's not affecting me, so therefore I shouldn't speak up about it, then that's how all genocides have happened. Like, we need to like stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, and we need to stand up for those even when they're standing up for themselves and having trouble gaining their rights. We just need to be good people like that.
One of the difficulties that I've also personally faced is that, so, when I try to explain to somebody the facts of embryology, and I'm like, look, let's just have an ethical conversation and consider like what's going on. They say, no, you're a man. And you as a man, you cannot speak on this issue. Um, my question to you would be, so one is like, okay, so, I mean, do you think that's even valid or that should be used by liberals? And then second, how would you go about talking effectively to the pro-choice community?
No, I think that it basically goes back to gender stereotypes of the woman being responsible for everything regarding children and babies, and the men just like not having anything to do with that. So to me, that's actually sexist, not only against men but also against women, because you're basically saying we're the brood mars, we're the baby makers, so only we can talk about it. Like that'd be like saying that only women can do the laundry of babies and like different household chores. So I think that men need to stand up for the rights of babies, and otherwise they're like because it goes back to the deadbeat dad idea. So yeah, I think it's their duty to like speak up for those who can't speak for themselves as well, despite the fact that you're not the ones that get pregnant. Because just because we get pregnant doesn't mean we should be stuck having this conversation alone when men are the ones who get us pregnant. So and then to pro-choicers, yeah, I do talk to them a lot. They tend to just plug their ears and say, la, 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 can't hear you. But I just think that they need to be more open-minded toward being against oppressing the unborn and actually not dehumanizing them. I think it's just basically like any other type of oppression, any other type of discrimination or prejudice. You just have to learn how to check your own privilege and not do it anymore.
Mm.
Basically, check their born privilege, so to say.
You know, I've heard also the objection that, well, okay, sure, like let's say that your ethical principles are really solid, right? But the problem is that, you are pro-birth, but you're not pro-life. Like, the child's born, enters the world, and let's say the mom is poor, right? So the child's going to live a miserable life. Maybe the mother has to give up so much just to have this child, and then they say, well, you pro-lifers just abandon her and leave her be. So, I mean, one question that we could ask is really like, are we just pro-birth? And then second, what are public policy options that we should support that would really help that mother and, that child succeed?
Yeah, so I was one of those kids who grew up poor, and we were on food stamps for a few months, and our house was foreclosed on for a bit until my parents decided to short sell it, and I've dealt with that, and it just kind of makes me feel bad that they think that those of us who are poor shouldn't get to live. But yeah, I just see where they're coming from with stereotypical conservatives who are against like food stamps and things like that and want to cut resources like that. But personally, I support all of those things. I've been on food stamps. Of course, I'm not going to want to cut the funding for food stamps. And I support universal health care, and I support all these different social safety nets. I also have ideas for like helping pregnant women. I think that I wish it was more common to like print up a flyer of all the different resources that pregnant women have in each county and then put it around in different places of businesses so that every woman gets used to seeing her options, because a lot of it is just women not knowing of their options. And then some of it is the culture as well. We do need to get rid of this mother shaming culture of telling us that we can't do it and we shouldn't get to have support. We do need more resources for poor people. I definitely agree with that. I think we could lean more toward the socialist European countries who do better at that. I think that we do need better health, not only better healthcare, but also better welfare systems and better homeless shelters and all sorts of good stuff like that. I definitely agree with pro-choicers who are typical liberals on like basically all of those issues.
Yeah. And the more I think about it too, I think many people are intuitively actually pro-life, right? But they claim to be pro-choice because they're like, well, if you look at all the pro-lifers, it's all those angry religious people, all those angry conservatives that I don't want to be associated with, And I think that there's kind of that problem where when ideas are associated with people and you don't like the people, then you think, oh, I don't like the ideas either. What can you
That's
say?
true.
What can you say to a pro-choicer to help them get out of that kind of, that binary, that loop?
Yeah, I would say they should start to familiarize themselves with the liberal, feminist, atheist, pro-lifers and go and look up organizations like Secular Pro-Life or Democrats for Life of America or Feminists for Life or Feminists for Nonviolent Choices or New Wave Feminists or Feminists Choosing Life of New York or Rehumanize International or All Our Lives or Consistent Life. There's like a ton of organizations out there for people like me, and there's a lot of us out there. There's like literally millions and millions of people out there like me. We just get ignored by both sides because the conservatives are too busy talking about their conservative ideals and not really paying attention to us. And then the liberals who are pro-choice kind of deny that we even exist in the first place. So yeah, the stereotypes definitely hurt the pro-life movement, but I think both sides need to be more welcoming of people like us who are like more who don't fit the stereotypes and who are like actually like agree with pro-choicers on everything except abortion. So
You know,
I wish that people did more to promote us instead of like ignore us.
I think one time in a debate that I was having with somebody, I mentioned your page, Atheists for Life, and or is it Pro-Life Atheist?
Pro-life.
And yes, Pro-Life Atheist. And so I mentioned your page, and I remember the person kind of looked at me with this kind of shocked look, like, this is impossible. This can't be happening. And then they looked at your page, they looked at some of the stuff, and they said, oh, yeah, she's bought up by religious people, or she's somehow affiliated with a religious organization. So obviously, like, let's put it on the table, right? Like, you are definitely all the things you say you are: an atheist, a feminist, a liberal, and pro-life. And you said vegan too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like,
Yeah, I've been this way for like the longest time now.
okay, and you're not associated with any religious organizations, right?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay.
I'm not even
Yes.
superstitious.
Yeah, I don't know why people take those little cheap shots at, people's credentials when they don't even have any basis for it. But
I know it's weird.
I mean, so I think one final thing that we can discuss is also the abortion debate in well, not just America but Canada, and for a larger part of the Western world, which is, or even the developing world. But how can we work at making this more civil? What have you found that gets pro-choice people realizing, oh, like, this is the better way to do it? And what can you tell to conservatives like me, like, what I should avoid doing?
Yeah, so I think common ground is the key. If pro-choicers like talking to pro-choicers about the things that we all agree on, like supporting pregnant and parenting women and poor people, and just going through the list of the different things we do agree on to try and help them realize, oh, like we're not the boogeymen who like hate everyone. We just also include the unborn and helping and those we want to help. So I think pro-choicers do tend to stereotype us a lot, but breaking through those stereotypes is really the best way to get them to actually listen. So people like me who are liberal and feminist and atheist, we do need to work on speaking out more and being more activist, because a lot of people like me tend to be quiet about it because we're afraid of getting criticized. But working through that and trying to learn how to basically come out would actually do a lot of good, because we need all hands on board. Anyone we can get to help out and to break through those stereotypes, that'll be the best. And as far as conservatives, just be welcoming of any and all people who are willing to fight for the unborn, whether they consider themselves like LaVeyan Satanists or people who have crazy body modifications and tattoos and piercings or vibrant hair or whatever. Just be welcoming and make space for us and make sure we feel like we're like one of the group instead of just on our own.
Yeah. I think I'm going to recommend to all conservatives and all religious people who are also pro-life, stop quoting scripture, stop
Yeah.
saying we're made in the image of God. Like, I personally believe that because I am conservative and Christian. But look, like, you know, you don't need to say that to make the pro-life case. And in fact, when you do say it, it just makes things worse because it goes back to that whole association problem. Um,
Yeah.
I don't
You
know
definitely
though.
don't need to quote Bible quotes in order to make a case against abortion. So it's
Yeah,
best left out of the conversation.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Well, Kristen, I had a great time tonight talking to you. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we end?
I would like to give a shout out to Albany Rose because I have had that page Pro-Life Atheist for the last few years, but it was actually handed down to me by her, and it was handed down to her by someone else. I forget who at this point. So technically I didn't create the page, but I have been the sole admin for like a few years. But Albany Rose is a really good pro-life atheist advocate as well, and she recently came out as Satanist as well. So I'm really proud of her for being herself and trying to brave the hardships of being considered one of the non-stereotypical pro-lifers as well. So, and thank you so much for having me on. This was a great experience.
Yeah, no problem. And, it's really great that we're having these conversations. I freaking love Albany Rose. I actually interviewed her on this page. So, like, she's just a great woman. And I really appreciate all the work that you're doing on your side of the political aisle.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Well, this has been our episode for Intellectual Conservatism. It's a little late at night on both sides of our time zone. So I'm going to cut it a little short. But thank you so much. And stay tuned for more episodes from Intellectual Conservatism. Thank you.